This is a panel which in some ways will pick up on the conversation from this morning's presentations on innovation and the experience of work in higher education. Because people have also been asking about narrative practices, we're going to take a fairly narrative approach to talking through our own experiences. I'm delighted to introduce this group of people who have very different experiences of working in higher education. Lee Scullerup-Bassett already spoke this morning, but you may not have been in the room. Petra, your middle name, how do I pronounce it?
Dirkes-Truhn, or if you want to try your hand at some German, Petra Dirkes-Truhn.
You feel free to practice that in a low manner.
Petra is fine, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not.
Yeah, Bonnie would rename that instantly. And Jeffrey Kiefer, who is particularly easy to pronounce.
I'm known for being easy, yes.
And
the New Yorker.
And so we're just going to kind of fly into this, but I wanted to begin with a story from being in Palo Alto. Some of you have seen on the blog I've been writing a bit about being in Palo Alto. I find this a fairly odd place to be discussing labour justice. And while I was thinking about this, I was walking down the main street of Palo Alto and came across something that I'm sure many of you have also seen. There's a very small, very polite, very contained protest outside the Apple store in the middle of Palo Alto on behalf of a local carpenters union. So I stopped to talk to the very smartly dressed person, and he said that they're protesting against Apple's use of non-unionized Canadian labour on other Apple projects, not on the Apple store itself, but on something that's hidden away and out of sight. So this union had an explicit understanding with the Apple Corporation that no non-unionized labour would be used in construction. And Apple have taken advantage of being somewhere else to do just that. I thought this was a resonant experience for us in higher education, where our own labour practices are often much shabbier than we put in the brochure, particularly when we're talking to students and their parents. And the question that we ask ourselves is the one that Rebecca Hogue asked this morning: what do we tell the students about our hiring practices, about the industrial structure of our industry? So we're here to tell you a little bit about how we each came to this point. And I wanted to begin by just taking you through a really simple set of questions and giving you a moment to reflect on this question in your own experience. This is not think, pair, share. This is think quietly to yourself.
We can find your pen, you can write it down,
Yeah,
tweet it out.
We wanted to encourage you to write down the answers to these questions, and then the panelists will kind of take you through their own narrative of coming to this point. Just now, Petra said the most beautiful thing: all I have is who I am here. And that was, I think, exactly what brings us all to this point. All I have of my account of work is who I am here, because it's always changing. So take a moment, just think about, if you were asked, what do you do, what would you say about yourself? Just take a moment to write it down or think about it. If someone says, what do you do, what is the answer that you give? All of us who've recently flown have been asked this at customs. What do you do? And there's a range of shifty answers that we give if we work in higher education. We don't want to appear to be above our station. We don't want to appear like somebody who thinks that we're better than other people who work, or less securely hired. So who are you and what do you do? How did you get here? This is not a straightforward question at all, but what we wanted to ask you is, looking back in your own trajectory to this point, can you recognize a moment at which you acted with some intent and that brought you here? Or are you here because something happened to you, some accident, some opportunity opened up? I've heard over the last couple of days some extraordinary stories of career accident, including someone whose identity I'll protect, who was called in to be offered an extremely significant job and believed until that sentence came out of someone's mouth that she was being disciplined for her use of Twitter. In other words, I think higher education is full of opportunistic redirection of careers, and that can be disappointing and unsettling and satisfactory. There's a range of things. The next question that we're really interested in is, what is happening right now? What is your practical working experience of the impact of change? Many of us working in higher education don't feel that we're controlling the changes around us, but that they are controlling us. Many of our own practices of workplace identity are practices of managing and coping and hoping for the best and noticing things fall under the table and hoping no one else notices that thing perhaps didn't get done in an optimal way. Because one of the big things that's changing about how we work is the load that's placed upon us. And one of the big drivers of that load is the thing that is dear to all of us, innovative practice. It takes the lid off the tin in a terrifying way. And the next question that we've thought about as a group, where do we see this changing in the short term? This is the horizon of the Horizon report. What is a short-term change? What is a medium-term change? What do we think is about 5 years down the track? And this is the question that we'll convene around right at the end together. What can we do to introduce practices that make higher education a more sustainable, more healthful career, however people choose to engage with it, at whatever level they're in it, including students, whatever partnerships people in other kinds of sectors form with higher education colleagues? How can we make this whole thing feel less like a hamster wheel that is running off its own spindle with uncontrolled momentum? So I'm going to start by opening this up to Lee, and each of the people in these chairs will speak for maybe 5 minutes on their own experience of walking through these questions.
Okay. You can keep them all in my head at once. I am Lee Scallert-Bassett, and I always say, you may know me as Ready Writing on Twitter, because I've had this, in a lot of ways, bifurcated identity, where there's the me in front of my class, there's the me who works in the university, and then there was the me who blogs and the me who tweets excessively. And for the longest time in my job as an educator, nobody it was the biggest open secret on my campus, right? I have a blog on Inside Higher Ed, which is a fairly large and prominent platform within the realm, and I have over 7,000 followers on Twitter, which isn't like Justin Bieber levels of fame, but I think okay for somebody in higher education, and not one person on my campus. It was like the open secret, right? My name is there. My handle isn't my name, but my name is there. My name is attached to my blog, and no one knew that I was doing that. And so there was really this bifurcated sort of identity. And even in my current job, I work as a faculty instructional consultant, so I help faculty get better teachers. I would go into a consultation and, be talking to people, and then at the end it would be whispered to me sort of on the side, oh, and by the way, I really like your blog. And why are we whispering, right? And so there is this disconnect, and you ask me, who I am and what I do. I'm a teacher, and I see myself both as a teacher. This is going to sound condescending now that I'm thinking about it, but I see myself as much as a teacher or an educator or a communicator, because I think those things are very closely and interrelated, both on the blog, on Twitter, and in front of my students. And it's only recently that I've been struggling with finally being able to reconcile the Ready Writing persona that I have online, which is very much me. Jonathan Rees met me for the first time, and he says, I feel like you're the person I know the best in the whole world whom I've never met before. And I think a lot of people who follow me and who read me actually have that feeling about me. And so there was no sort of disconnect in my own mind versus who I am on Twitter and who I am in the classroom and who I am in my work. But people's attitudes, I guess, towards me were very bifurcated in that kind of way within higher education. And that told me a lot about how higher education viewed my role, my job, and how they viewed my social media work and advocacy for adjuncts and now advocacy for staff roles within higher education. And so that's where I've come to is why am I here is because I was a loudmouth on Twitter. And I was outspoken because I would not accept the treatment of adjuncts and sessional faculty, and I would not let that stand. And I could not let that stand. And so that's sort of how I got here. Is I was talking to somebody who's doing great work and research in Stanford and learning and affect and all of that. And I'm like, wow, that's a much better reason to be here than I'm Twitter famous. But there you go. That's what I am and why I'm here. And one of the things, ironically, that I always say that Twitter and being on social media has taught me is how to listen. And listen carefully and listen actively and listen empathetically. And that really, I think, if we want to look at the next 5 years, if there's something that is going to help us, and I think adjuncts and staff are particularly suited for this, and not necessarily administrators and not necessarily faculty, because they haven't always had to, is that adjuncts couldn't afford to burn bridges, and staff can't really afford to burn bridges in a lot of ways because of their precarious labor situation. Exempt, right? Who here is an exempt person working, right? That's what they put in staff. You're exempt, which means you're an at-will employee. Even with benefits and a great salary and all that kind of stuff, you were exempt. And so, if anything, it's really learning to listen actively and empathetically in order to be able to work with one another. And I think that's a skill in a lot of cases that we've forgotten, we've lost. Maybe we never had it, I don't know. I don't have nostalgia for this great former time of higher education where everything was perfect. But I think that in 5 years, if we want to be able to get through that, I think that is one of the most important things that we need to start actively doing, is just really listening to one another. And I think that's really important. I'll leave it at that.
Great. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming today. In thinking about what I could share with you today, I actually had, several things going on in my mind, and I'm gonna have to warn you that this will probably be the most personal talk, if you can call it a talk, that I've ever given, because I think I have to tell you a very personal story. So anyway, let me just kind of quickly tick off all those, hats that I'm wearing. Right now, here at Stanford, I'm a lecturer in the comparative literature department. Very, small part-time kind of role. I teach 2 courses per year at this point. I'm also affiliated with the program in feminist gender and sexuality studies. I teach courses for them. And then now I have a new job, which I really love. I'm very happy and grateful for, in the Vice Provost's Office for Teaching and Learning. And there, my lofty title is Director of Interdisciplinary Teaching and Learning. I'm very interested in connecting humanities to engineering, to other sort of interdisciplinary fields, and think about teaching and learning. And so I think the most time I will spend is on the personal part, that is the part of how did you get here. The other thing I want to mention before I start into that is that, as you can hear in my accent, I'm originally from Germany, so I'm actually a product of the German education system. My husband and I came to the States in '95, so I actually went through the whole thing, kind of did the Staatsexamen, which is basically MA level, ending. I wanted to become a high school teacher, so that's really where my heart is, and I've always wanted to become a teacher, and I come from a family of teachers too. So I started with that and then went into the PhD program, actually at the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. My husband was at Carnegie Mellon. And so from then on, I've had this sort of dual identity. And actually, I mention this because I think it's important for the digital stuff that I'm going to get to in a moment, because I've had a paradigm shift a bunch of times. And even now, I don't speak in my mother tongue, right? So, I studied English, obviously, and hopefully it's not that bad. But I'm not, I'm used to switching paradigms. And so I've done that a bunch of times. So one of the things you need to know about me is that I'm really a traditional humanities person. I love books. I love archives. I love all that stuff. I love the dusty smell of old letters. I know how to put my gloves on in the archive, all that stuff. And I love teaching. And so the easiest way to explain my sort of transition into my very sort of jumpy transition into digital pedagogy is because I came from the teaching side, and I saw opportunities there. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about myself, and some of you may know this already if you recognize that last part of my name. It's something that I can't hide, and I'm not intending to hide. I'm married to Sebastian Truhn, who is the founder of Udacity. Been together for 30 years, so this is, not a recent thing. We met in high school, okay. So, And as you can see, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got into digital pedagogy. But basically, he and I, I've been a humanities person all my life. He's been a computer scientist. And before Udacity or any of that stuff came about, we've had many, many discussions about humanities, computer science, all the differences, and how it goes or doesn't go together, and all these things. And so then 2011 happens. Okay, the big year, the huge MOOC hype, all that stuff. And I'm actually still am partly critical of a lot of that stuff, but I'm also not partly because I'm so close to it. I see a lot of the things that go on behind the scenes, and probably some of you, I'm pretty aware, and that's totally fine. Some of you in this room have been very critical of Udacity, and that's totally fine. I think we should have those conversations. So, don't feel like you can't talk to me. You still can. But I want to say, so literally Udacity was started in our basement. Okay, so we're like, sitting at dinner having discussions, and then Sebastian goes back in the basement, windowless basement, and like records the first lectures. And the other piece of the puzzle I want to tell you, and this is the really personal part, I really have to think about, what should I tell you? But I think I have to do it because I'm also a feminist, gender and sexuality studies person, and I really believe that this is part of the wonderful image that Lee used in the earlier session, the Gordian knot, where it doesn't, it's not easy to talk, to untangle all these things. I'm wearing all these hats. I'm an adjunct. I'm now in administration. I'm married to this hated guy, pretty much, not by me, but anyway, this very controversial figure, shall we say. But I've also known him for 30 years, okay, so I have context. But then there's also this other thing. I, like many of you here, I'm sure, can I just see a show of hands who identifies at least partly as adjunct? So obviously me. Okay, that's quite a bunch of us. The reason I got to be adjunct was because of pregnancy, and actually because of infertility problems. And this is the really personal part that you're probably thinking TMI. Oh my God, shut up. But I'm not going to go into it very very deeply. But so I was on the tenure track down in LA at CSUN, California State University Northridge. Really loved my job. It's very public, public university, very different kinds of students in Stanford. And we thought that we couldn't have kids at that point. And then when it finally happened, we were a commuting couple too. So when it finally happened, very happily so, I had to give up the job. I mean, there was a question like, should he have moved on there? We thought about that. He offered. It was very nice. But ultimately, so I ended up here at Stanford. Later, actually I took like 18 months off where I was writing my book and kind of taking care of our son. And then Stanford literally helped to get me back in. And so I was an adjunct here and very grateful. And so this actually was before the 2011 stuff happened. And so, I don't want to take up too much time, so let me just kind of wrap up by kind of saying that the digital pedagogy idea came basically from this sort of friction between, what was happening at Stanford with the MOOC stuff and also with Udacity, and me just really trying to think the humanities have to be part of this conversation, and it cannot be in the same way that STEM is doing it. For obvious reasons. And if you're a humanities person, I don't have to tell you that essays are a different thing than quizzes, and A and B testing is not quite as, there's skills that get developed over time. We read books, they take time, and so on. And so I started experimenting with blended learning. And so one of the wonderful experiences that I've had is really this idea that, even I, as an adjunct, can just go wild with this. I mean, it was a strange, weird freedom, like, this precarious job position. I wasn't even sure, I was pretty sure I was never going to get on the tenure track at Stanford, and I'm pretty sure that will, that's it, and that's fine. But that gave me the strange freedom to just experiment with many things, and I just kind of went for it. And then also connecting to an international community for that. That's actually how I met Bonnie, I think. But, so 2012, we convened a small band of people here and wrote this, then I guess also controversial Bill of Rights and Principles for Learning in the Digital Age. Kathy Davidson was part of that, Sean Michael Morris. I'm not going to be able to name them all, but, about 12 people. And kind of ran with that. And ever since, it's been kind of a wild ride. And now that I've entered the administrative side, I feel like, the two things come together in a really nice way. I feel like we can do things, for example, for lecturers, through this new administrative role that I was never able to do by myself in my own little lowly adjunct position. So of course I'm not the only one doing this. There's many other people thinking. But I'm very hopeful that in this sort of new administrative role there can also be I have a new kind of voice, not necessarily a more dominant voice, but have different channels of influence. So I think I want to leave it at that. I don't want to make any predictions about the future because since 2011 it's been unpredictable. So I'm done with predicting anything.
It's your fault.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. Jeff, go ahead.
Thanks. Kind of makes me feel pretty traditional here. It was interesting when Kate was introducing us. She had talked about this being a panel on labor and labor justice and bringing up those kinds of ideas. And as my mind tends to jump, and often I make several jumps, and it seems like I'm thinking, well, anyway, I do that anyway, just like I just did. And I thought, labor justice, and then I wrote down to myself, okay, well, justice for whom? Because we've talked a lot about justice, and we've talked about those kinds of labor issues, but few people have really defined what they mean by that. Well, that's okay, because we don't know what the justice is for and what the oppression is, if it really is oppression. Because we haven't really defined that either, but there's a sense kind of floating around in the ether that that exists. Well, that's okay, because then I wrote down, well, by whom? Well, who's doing all of this oppression? Because with a variety of different populations that are in here, whether they are people who do adjunct work or people who work in industry or people who are administration or students or whatever, the perception of what justice is and who's oppressing whom can really shift. Well, I didn't end there because then I wrote down, well, who speaks for those people? Because I think that within those kinds of industries or within those kinds of areas, whoever really, however they get appointed or self-appointed or the loudest ones or whatever it might be, the most tweet followers or whatever that might be, well, what does that mean and how does somebody really speak for other people, especially when there's such diversity? And I think that we've seen a lot of that diversity. I know that's really clear to me that we talk about diversity, but we really don't mean diversity. I mean, I'm the only white male up here, and somehow I'm the face of diversity here, right? Well, but I'm not really sure that that's consistently what we're talking about here. So then I finally wrote down, well, what do these people get for this, right? So when we talk about diversity, we talk about who gets to speak for that, and the power to name then gives those people power because then they become this anonymous me, whoever they are. They get to have the power to then name and therefore set the argument and then really create the narrative. And then, of course, that comes down to, well, what's in it for them? And I think that WIFM, that what's in it for me, which is something that I had taken as a core component back in the years when I used to teach in business and management communication, that was really the core issue, and that's really the core issue that I come down to with all of my teaching and learning. Just as a little bit of background, I started in the humanities also years ago. My first 3 degrees were in humanities. But I was very interested, after teaching in middle and high school, I was very interested in teaching older people, like people who are like 18 years old or older. And so I started working in organizational learning, and I've really spent most of my life working in organizational learning, managing projects, managing grants, working with large organizations within learning functions, though I've always taught. And it was really that desire to teach and that love of the interaction, not just managing the process, but actually seeing people that we get to see the light bulb that go off every now and then when we see that. That's what really led me into adjunct teaching. So after 10 years, I just got my 10-year pin. I was quite surprised to get that from the university. There was no explanation for it. I just got the 10-year pin. It's like, oh, okay, I guess it's been 10 years. But it was really going and starting to teach because, once again, you just happen to be there. How we get to do that. I wasn't looking for that because it's very, very difficult, strangely enough, to get an adjunct position. If it's in a field that you want at a certain institution, it happens through networks and who we know and, conversations. And sometimes it's just like life, as 80% is just showing up or 90%. I happen to be there. They had a need. They say, hey, have you ever thought about teaching? Yeah, sounds cool. And that's kind of like how it leads into that. But the fundamental that it still comes down to, well, what's in it for me? Well, what's in it for me to do that, and how aligned is my WIFM with yours and with whatever it is that you think about when you first answer those questions that Kate gave us about how do you define yourself, what box do you put yourself in, how do you answer that, does that depend on who you are here, does it depend on what you're with your family, or if we challenge you, okay, what you wrote down when Kate asked you to do that, if we then said, okay, great, go put it on Twitter now. How much would you adapt it and adopt that because you're speaking to a different audience, right? And these are the kinds of issues, or we could keep it safe and keep it inside Slack. which is still online, and really nothing online is completely safe. But these are some of the areas that I think are really of value to have these kinds of conversations, because short of having these, it really becomes the echo chamber of whomever is around us, that's what feeds back to us about what diversity is, or who has power, or what even is going to happen in the 3 years and 5 years in some of those plans. I mean, I think that the shifts that we've seen in higher education, or education in general, 5 years ago, I think that we probably couldn't imagine some of the things which we're doing here. And as we saw in one of the presentations earlier today, where certain technologies come up and they don't just add, they actually change the way that we work, like television or something. And I thought about that. I just wrote down, well, the internet does that also. Well, who knows who in some other basement someplace who is developing the next thing that's going to change us, right? So I just love the idea of Uber. I mean, today I used Uber for the first time, and it was, yeah, and it was magic that I got to get out of the car without giving anything. You know, I mean, of course, I paid several times that from what I really was charged, but that's okay. I didn't see that, right? And even those kinds of things about, well, what's the effects and what do we need to see or not need to see for it to be real? These are some of the issues that I think we were kind of thinking about when we were spending some time thinking really about this on the panel. So
what we might do is open this to discussion, but I'm going to just take a liberty and put something to this group of people. Over lunch, Jeffrey and I were talking about whether or not the freedom to work casually, as we say in Australia, in relation to higher education is becoming like a kind of unpaid internship. It's not actually unpaid, but the critique of unpaid internships is that they've significantly diminished the diversity of people who are able to take those experiences because they can afford to. Mm-hmm. And when I think about students who over the years have approached me and said, I think I could be an academic, and I look at their ability, and I say on ability terms, absolutely you could. But are you willing, particularly if you're female, to forego the likelihood of secure employment that will lead to the ability to take paid maternity leave, which we have as a privilege in Australia? If you're working casually for several years before you get a job, you're vanishingly unlikely to have access to those kinds of benefits. Moreover, if you do have children, you won't be able to take paid leave to take care of them, as I would. If you get sick, as I did, you won't have access to sick leave. And on that basis, I find it very hard to recommend to young, bright undergraduates that they start on the path towards a career in the world that we work in. And to me, this is a stuck point. This is, to use Bonnie's phrase earlier, this is one of the things I'm stuck on. If we want to make a profession that's sustainable for us, how do we also make it sustainable for people who aren't even in it yet? And we are so scrupulously silent to them about the conditions of hiring. We require adjunct staff often not to tell them. Most of our young, smart undergraduates have no idea that the person sitting in front of them is not a full prof with a book-lined office and sabbatical every now and then, and, you know. How do we do this more honestly, and how do we do it sustainably into the future? That, I think, is where I hope we can begin. We have microphones. We have the technology. Who has a question?
You have on-off switches?
We do.
I should turn mine back on.
Does anyone have not necessarily a question, but a contribution on how we change the situation that we're in?
And even flipping that from the opposite perspective, I find it sometimes helpful just to turn the question upside down. Is there a problem with that? I mean, when you consider the growth in adjunct education, the adjunct faculty, the notion of the full-time tenured faculty is going away. Well, that becomes then at-will employment, exempt employment, as you mentioned, just like everything else in the economy, right? I mean, so is that really a problem then? Or is higher education just catching up with the workforce that everybody else works in? I mean, because we see that with even in general labor unions as well. I mean, there is a decline in that will probably not come back in any, at least in the same way that it ever was. Is that a problem, or is it just a new opportunity? So even if we flip it around, it just may present some new ways of considering these things.
I just have one quick comment. This is not for Jeffrey. I mean, it's just kind of in response to what Kate was saying. I think, being in the humanities, traditional humanities, not necessarily digital humanities, traditional humanities, I often talk to students. I'm actually, as you probably know, if you're an adjunct, not technically allowed, at least not at this university, to advise any grad students. They take my classes, but I cannot be their advisor. But they still come to me, some of them do, for informal advice. And so, they're obviously, I want to be honest with them. And so, especially in the humanities, and especially if it's women, because there are gendered bodies there, I'm honest and I say, look, humanities, you had the slide up earlier in the other talk. What is it, 76% of all instructors in academia at this point, not just humanities, 76% are adjuncts, which is crazy. But anyway, so what I tell my humanities students, because it's also very difficult to get jobs anyway in the humanities, is that, in a way, not to sound too techno-utopian here, but that the digital skills that they have will actually be transferable. So that, if they are thinking about becoming a professor, to really think with a wider lens and to think about what are some of the skills that are actually my skill set that will be transferable, and to not kind of go through academia like this with blinders on like I used to do, but to really think about, maybe I won't have a job in academia, and what do I do now to prepare myself? And right now, a lot of my colleagues are not really, there are some people who are taking some steps, but it's definitely not really part of graduate education yet. So I totally agree with you, Kate. I think it's a very important topic. We need to talk about it.
So I have a question. It's really about research in this area. I'm wondering, are you aware of research that points to this being a problem for students long term? So at Davidson, for example, our students will come back 5 and 10 years later to connect with faculty for, it could be for an application for graduate school, or they need some recommendation, or they just need to reconnect on some level for advice. Are you seeing, is there research out there that shows this is a negative impact on higher education over the lifetime of a learner?
In Australia, I think we're seeing that there is a potential bridge between research into something else and the possibility that this is a factor. So we have a lot of research into student engagement, as you do here, and that research shows consistently that highly engaged students value time out of class. They value being able to consult with the person who's teaching them, and they value the opportunity to engage directly with that person's research. The implication there is that the person teaching them is research active and has time available for consultation. The hiring practices for our casual and sessional workforce mitigate against those benefits occurring. But we don't yet have really solid long-term data, although Marcia might know more about this. We don't really have long-term data on how it affects students to be taught by a salaried member of staff versus an hourly paid member of staff. And this is partly because whenever we mention that we might look into this, there's a very clever trick that's played which says, surely you're not suggesting that those people aren't good teachers.
Yeah.
And the question is shut down. Now, I'm always really interested in a question that gets shut down. I think if it gets shut down that quickly and someone really doesn't want it asked, then it's probably really interesting and useful to ask it. But we haven't, I don't know, Marcia, if you know, we haven't got anything. This is an area in which we have almost no solid research. We've only just begun to research how much of it there is.
Yeah, and I mean, particularly in the United States, it's a fraught topic as well, because there's the study that comes out that says students do as well, and how do we evaluate it even? How do we know what as well is? Is it test scores? Is it standardized testing? Is it graduation rates? Is it DEW, which is, we don't have Fs in Kentucky. We give students E's. That's the failure. So we call them DEW rates, so the rate of students who get D's and E's and withdraws in a class. And so looking at that, so what do we mean by being a successful teacher? I think that that's one of the stop points as well, that we can't even agree on that, right? Student evals are crap unless they're not. DEW rates are crap unless they're not. Graduation rates are crap unless they're not. And even, like, we can barely keep track of their employment, let alone their happiness or success with institutions, and then to be able to disaggregate that. And so you get a study, and remember, probably a couple of years ago now, it feels like yesterday in a certain way, that there was a study that came out and showed that somehow adjuncts taught as well, if not better, than tenured faculty or tenure-track faculty. And, but then how do you want to interpret that data, right? Does that mean we no longer need tenure because, hey, we're doing just as good a job on $2,000 a class? What do we need to pay a $100,000 professor for? You know? And so there's that, how do we interpret that data, or how is that data, or how are those studies interpreted, which is, I think, a really important part of narrative as well, right? Where the narrative that adjunct activists were trying to shape that is like, we look at the great job that we do. Imagine how much better we would do if we just had like a salary and maybe an office. I didn't have to worry about benefits and worry about when I got sick. Like, imagine how much better I would be. But there's a real danger in that as well, right? I mean, the most recent case, and this might be a bad case, but it's a recent one, the case of the sessional faculty at Berkeley who was apparently let go for being too good a teacher, right? Because he transgressed the pedagogical culture within that institution, and he was a sessional faculty member who they said, oh, no, we can just do this because that's his contract, right? And he can show with some data that my students do really well, right? So why are you firing me or not renewing me? You know, so we're starting to, I think, do those kinds of studies. There are people who want to do those kinds of work. Particularly when it comes to the ever-present accountability. Some of this work is going to, or some of that data will start being available, and it's just parsing it down. But it's really fraught territory, and I really don't want to shut it down, but I also don't want it to have an adverse effect. And again, this is where narrative comes in. How do we shape, how do we frame, how do we tell these stories if and when we get this kind of data?
I think can I just bring a story in here? I run a blog for people who work in this way in Australia, people who are insecurely hired, and we hear lots of stories that are really heartbreaking. But I saw a story on Twitter from a US adjunct activist who's quite well known to many of us here. She was in the emergency room with her small child who was in the emergency room for a serious reason, and this is a small child. And she was tweeting from there because she was in despair because she had taken her grading with her. And she said, I have to do my grading because if I don't do my grading in a timely fashion, this shows up on my evaluations and I won't get hired again. So she's there with her child in the emergency room with her grading. Now, this is my response to the question, isn't this just how the whole economy is going? Absolutely it is for many, many workers in many sectors. And I think we care about all of it. You know, we shouldn't, I think, with respect to Jeffrey, I mean, I don't think we should succumb to the logic that because other employers are cutting these particular corners, we are happy to see them cut in our profession because the narrative tells us the story of the human impact. And I think that should be important to us. It really, that child in that emergency room should matter to us all as a profession. Further questions? I realize that was a bit tough thumping, but you know,
yeah.
You really stay with me, so I don't mean to, you know, silence the conversation.
So I was wondering what you, for me in the academy, there's something very interesting about our relationship to being compensated for our labor, right? So as a graduate student, if you happen to be in an institution where your graduate students are unionized, you actually have it pretty good, right? But otherwise, you're in this strange space where you have a bachelor's degree, however, you're not a faculty member, you're not even an adjunct, you're meant to be seen as a student, yet act as a professional, all the while not being compensated as a professional, right? So that, to me, it cascades forward to kind of for lack of a better phrase, kind of the Uberification of the academy, because what happens, it was interesting that Jeffrey ended with Uber, because that's really what's happening in the academy right now. There's contingent labor is plentiful, so rather than being a passenger, like administrators can just call on contingent labor and fill those gaps, and it's very convenient for them. But what's interesting is that, and I want to hear your thoughts, is it seems to a certain extent that this is an internal problem that we almost are at fault for, because we were premised on that already as by not giving graduate students, not compensating them for their labor in a way that makes sense.
Well, we reproduce systems. And so, you know, I got a $12,000 stipend to teach class and to go to graduate school, and was told by my supervisors, or my mentors as an undergraduate and as master's students, what a fantastic deal. That's awesome. Okay, right? I'm 23. What do I know? In that sort of way. And so, yeah, we have perpetuated it, but a lot of the times, again, it's that acculturation to it. You know, I was warned. I was told, you know, don't go to grad school without funding. Are you sure you want to go to grad school? I was stubborn. I was like, yes, I am smart. I'm wonderful. I love reading books. I'm going to be so successful. And I was. I got a tenure-track job. And but again, then telling me, okay, fine, we feel like I've told you about the job market and all that kind of stuff, and this was before 2008. And then when I come with my offers, they're like, yeah, take the $12,000 a year one. That's your best offer, and that's like actually really awesome for you. And so I went, and I was just like, yay, this is great. People who I trust and know and believe tell me that this is a wonderful deal, and so I will go for it. And then, you know, being told, oh, this is a pretty good deal, I was really lucky when I adjuncted, because I adjuncted at Cal State. In the Cal State system, which is adjunct and actually has benefits and has decent salary, right? But again, it was there was no other talk about anything else. This was just like, here is what you do, and okay, I'll go and do that. And there's a lot of the times there's either willful ignorance or just the idea of perpetuating it. It's like, well, I lived on $12,000 a year when I was a grad student. I turned out fine, and so you, too, should live on $12,000 as a graduate student, and you, too, will turn out fine if you work hard and sacrifice and have a wife at home who will take care of everything. Then you, too, can be as successful as I am post-recession, post-gutting of higher education, post-everything. So I'm sorry, not that I'm bitter or anything. I'm sure you're all lovely and wonderful and do an awesome job opening the eyes of poor undergraduate and master's students who are like, have stars in their eyes, and they come in like, I so want to do a PhD. Oh, honey.
No, I'll just add one little thing to this. This is an honest question. I don't have an answer for this, but I'm a member of the Modern Language Association, MLA, as probably a lot of you are. This is an honest question. I'm really not sure at this point how much these organizations can help in kind of advocating and moving things. Lily is going like, I know. I mean, you know, they're trying, but I'm sort of wondering, like, where is the voice? You know, how much can we or should we even look to these sort of bigger institutions to kind of move things forward? And obviously you can kind of, you know, if you can afford it, literally if you can afford it in your job, you can help beat the drum about lecturers and adjuncts and grad students. But, you know, for those who cannot afford that because they're afraid to lose their job, like, who speaks for them? So that's a big question, you know, it really is. So I think those of us who can afford it need to drum the beat, to beat the drum, maybe a little louder.
And I would also say, and again, this goes into the listening, like, they might not feel comfortable to speak out, but they might be willing to speak to you individually and to listen to those stories and to listen to those narratives. And like, do you know who the adjuncts are on your campus? Do you know their names? Do you know what classes they teach? In a lot of places, they keep that very hidden on purpose. But then, you know, asking them who they are, what they do, what they're concerned. Who are the ones who actually enjoy being adjuncts and are there on purpose? Who are the ones who want to, who are desperate for a tenure-track job? Who of them are place-bound, right, and are there because of circumstances? Your story resonated with me because it was the same thing. I gave up a tenure-track position because I chose family, and that's the kiss of death in academia, right? I'm not allowed to say that I love my family more than my career, right? But again, what are their reasons? What are they there for? What do they need? And again, that whole idea of speaking for them, but listening to them first. Right.
Well, it's also, I think, somewhat recent that some of the professional associations, which traditionally had focused around members who were full-time academic tenured positions, certainly MLA and
AHA.
Right. And I think about AERA, where I was a member for years, but that means absolutely nothing if you're not a tenure track or going into that I mean, the benefits just aren't there really for the membership, and I think that only recently are they starting to realize that with a shrinking population that they had traditionally worked toward, that if they want to maintain their own power and their own WIFM, which is to maintain their own jobs and their own journals, that they need to then extend who they're really speaking to as their audience. But I also wanted to come back to your question about compensation for labor. Way back in the days when I did my undergraduate work, I was a philosophy major as well. Knowledge was not something one would be compensated for. Knowledge was something which you sought knowledge for its own sake. I mean, that's what the early, that early traditional philosophy, knowledge is its own reward, and somehow that feeling of it keeps us warm, and keeps the lights on and stuff like that. But I think that becomes very challenging then when you start to say, well, we're going to need to get paid for the work. Well, paid for the work means you're a worker. But wait a minute, my job is to do research. My job is to do teaching, is to think theories and stuff. And now I'm being compensated like somebody who works in a factory. I need to produce X number of people. I could only have X number of percent that doesn't pass. Otherwise, I'm doing something wrong. And I think that when the narrative then starts to shift towards that commodification and work as something that's work, as opposed to knowledge management or knowledge work, then it starts to make some of these issues a little bit fuzzier and a bit more problematic, which I think is really juicy that we have the opportunity here really to speak about that, because I don't know about you, but these aren't necessarily things that I talk about on my regular day-to-day work, because it just doesn't really come up. It's not a safe space, even though we're being recorded and tweeted here.
I was just going to say this workforce culture has been impacted in higher ed because it's not just academics, it's staff as well. So we're asked to do more with less, and we're giving more classes, or we're assigned more advisees, or whatever that is, in different shapes and forms. We're just mirroring a lot of, we think we need to work 68 hours a week. But we haven't said it as a culture, except for France, who said turn off your phone after 6 p.m. I worked at University of Toronto. We were kicked out at 5 because they said, we want you guys to have 3 p.m. off, go to the cottage on the weekends in the summer. We used to come in 15 minutes early, so it was 8:45, so we can get off early. But we haven't said, as organizations and institutions, that we're treating you like that kind of professional workforce, whether it's staff or it's academic at the university. So I think that cultural shift has to come in, and it's peer pressure, self-pressure, and it's institutional pressure that maybe needs to be think at holistically. And I think there are some places doing it very well, and some countries doing it decently as well. And I think we can learn from some of them instead of marrying this 60, 80-hour work week that we think we need to put in. Because I don't know about you, I think it's okay for us to check out sometimes and not, worry about that time to time.
It's interesting. When you had mentioned that, Laura, I thought about the Democratic debate last week when there was the question, well, wouldn't it be great if we learned from Denmark? But we're not Denmark. And I thought about that as almost being a microcosm of some of these issues, right? I mean, how can we learn from best practices, but we're not like that. We're really different, right? And often we like to think of ourselves as being different. And I'm saying the we, I mean, however we define the we. That was a theme also this morning, the we versus them. I mean, how do we define the we? Is the we people who just look like us, live in our neighborhoods, work in the field, whatever that might be? But I think that these are really, really valuable questions to raise.
Does anybody know the commercial? I think it's a beer commercial where they ask, when did it become a rebellious act to leave at 5 o'clock at the end of the day, right? And the guy who takes his jacket and goes off, and everybody's looking at him horrified, and he's just see ya. And I think that commercial resonates with, and there's a reason why they made it, right? It's not just us in that kind of way. And I think, Laura, thank you for bringing that up in terms of there are so many us's and them's in terms of higher education, in terms of expectations around work. We have hourly employees. We have staff who are sometimes hourly and sometimes salaried. We have administrators. We have faculty, and then we have contingent. And those are all different us's and all different work cultures, right? Where if you're hourly, what does that mean? So when University of Kentucky last year shut down because of snow, and it was legitimately dangerous, says the Canadian, there was a legitimate amount of snow, and it was legitimately dangerous because no one knows how to drive, and there's no salt. And I had a friend who was like, well, I'm going into work today. And I'm like, why are you going into work? And he's like, I'm hourly. If I'm not there doing work, I don't get paid, right? And I had a certain privilege where my boss was like, work from home. And faculty were all like, work from home, or we're canceling classes, or whatever it is. And this idea, too, and this is what makes intersections and collaborations really challenging and difficult sometimes, and I see this tension. You know, I am staff. I'm on a 12-month contract. I work 9 to 5. I have a supervisor who is faculty. You know, and summers are sort of the sacrosanct place, but at the same time, we have trouble asking for 2 weeks vacation. That is our right as staff. And then when we go on vacation, it can be difficult because it's like, well, why aren't you checking your email all the time? Because as faculty, that's the culture, right? That there's no such thing like, yeah, we're on 9-month contracts, but we work all summer. You know, that's not our vacation time, and I'm sure that you guys are all very mindful of all of these things as well. But again, there can be clashes sometimes and misunderstandings where faculty will email staff and be like, why aren't you solving my IT problem at 10 o'clock at night? Because they'll answer student emails at 10 o'clock at night. And so they don't understand, and so they think, well, staff are lazy, right? Whereas, you know, and then staff are like, God damn these faculty in terms of having those kinds of demands. So again, there are different us's and we's and them's and thoughts about what a workday is and what labor is and what should and shouldn't be compensated and when this day starts and ends, even within our own institutions. That can lead to a lot of misunderstandings.
Just before we take the last question, I just want to comment on this thing about email and faculty.
Sorry, I shouldn't have said emails.
I realized that I needed to stop hiding my children from my job and hiding my home from my job. And I needed to stop asking my children to accept that my job had fully encroached upon their home, not just my home, but their home, and their life and their capacity to get my attention during weekends, for example. So I told my students, a very large number of students, and all of my colleagues, I won't answer email outside normal working hours. Evenings and weekends, I won't see the notifications because I'm turning them off. So it's not that I'm going to I'm not even going to know you emailed me. And then I waited to see what happened because I'd never done anything like this before. Absolutely nothing happened. All of the students respected it. The first student that emailed me on a weekend said, I'm sorry to email you on a weekend, but I know you won't see this till Monday. It's just the right time for me to email. On Monday, could you tell me this? And I thought, wow, that was simple. And so I would like to evangelize that solution.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah. And when did that become a radical act as well, right? Like putting boundaries on our personal space and time. That's a radical act now.
Kristen has the last question, and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Thanks. So I'm part of DLearn because I think research is a lever for change. So with this in mind and wanting to change the narrative, what are the research questions you would pose to higher education to begin to address this?
That's a good one.
I think right off the bat, I would like to pose your question, the one you originally asked. I would like us to start to research tactfully, sensitively, but without fear, the impact of this on student learning. I just think we can.
And I don't know if this is just off the top of my head research question, but I'm kind of wondering how many, because, you know, I've actually told Kate before this panel and everybody, I'm going to be the one who's really positive about digital innovation. I haven't really gotten the chance to be that, but I was going to say, I would be very interested in seeing some data, how many of us, because we moved more into the digital space with our teaching and learning ideas, have actually been able to improve our situation. That would be really interesting, I think. And in what ways?
Yeah, and I'd be thinking about something. I'm just kind of like just jotting down a couple notes here, which is strange. I'm not used to writing. Have it open here. Does workplace permanency, right? Does workplace permanency actually stifle creativity and stifle innovation? And what effect does that have on learning?
And I'm going to give props to Allison on this one if she's in here. It was a question asked earlier on our panel around that adjuncts are cost-saving methods, right? But then interrogating that and saying, yes, it's a saving on the bottom line of the perhaps department budget, but how does it impact other budgets across a wide swath of campus? So things like HR, things like IT, things like instructional support, things like that to go alongside the student learning piece. Because I think more information is always better than less information. So I think that's what are the hidden costs, I guess you could say, of adjunct labor in that kind of way. What are those hidden costs? And we could do that, I think.
So on what I think is a positive note, that is, there is work to do and we have the capacity to do it.
More work, yes. There's your takeaway, guys. More work from the work panel.
We'll close out this discussion.
Over here.
Oh.
I have a suggestion for a research question, and it goes to one of the things I forget who says this or who said this, that you have a problem recommending to students who can't afford it to go into being a professor. And it seems to me, and this is probably truer in the humanities courses or in the humanities sections than anything else, that professorships are one of the only ways to get into academic research, and academic research is probably the only way that any research gets done in humanities. So probably a good research question to answer, and if this is true, it could probably be a good leverage point, would be, does diversity in researchers lead to better quality research?
I'm really delighted to end on that note, because I think the lost diversity to our profession is probably harming us in ways that we don't really understand. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you.